Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Ancient Literature. Okay, I hope you guys thought the video on Friday was at least decently entertaining in terms of whetting our appetite a little bit for Elizabethan drama. And I forgot to ask you guys. I know Miss McCullis is doing Shakespeare, but I think that's with eighth grade, and so you guys had it last year. But anyway, I will find out very soon. But yeah, we're gonna start in on this week. We are finding out we have 2 more full weeks, not including finals week, and then a half week next week. So plenty of time to do this play and a little more. There is a bit more to be said about Aeneid. Okay, I don't want to just totally kind of like leave that off abruptly and not kind of address some of our last little questions. We'll review Aeneid a bit before the final anyway, but I think we have a much needed chance to change gears a little bit. But yeah, so as we talked about, for those who were able to attend the reading on Wednesday, we saw how abruptly the poem ended, and that is one of the pieces of ammunition in the arsenal of scholars who claim that Aeneid has a pessimistic outlook on imperial Rome. We will address that a little more. We'll come back to it maybe like next week or something there, or maybe Shakespeare will give us a good opening, or he definitely will give us a good opening in terms of kind of circling back to that at least one more time. So we're not totally done with Rome by any means, but we definitely need to get some grounding in Elizabethan England as we proceed towards our last reading. Last, is it? Could we fit in another one? Who knows? We'll see. Okay, so we're jumping from the 1st century BCE or BC to the 16th century CE or AD. So we're taking about a 1500 year leap here, and it's important to at least kind of get our groundings a little bit and not just kind of like plow right into this new era without addressing some of what's been going on. So let's get just a real quick rundown of where we're at in terms of like if we're starting from the perspective of talking about William Shakespeare, and then we'll work back a little bit and kind of fill in some gaps. So Bill Shakespeare here is born on April 26th, 1564, and he dies in April as well, almost 60 years later. And let's see, I'm so bad at math. 30 plus 40. No, I'm sorry, 50 years later, exactly 50 years later. So his birthday and the day he passed away both happened like last week or like the past week and a half or so, which is kind of interesting. I wish I had thought to catch that. Also, another important British person having an impact on the world in a year that ends in the number 64. The Beatles are on Ed Sullivan in 1964. Okay, it's a little different than a famous playwright being born, but there you go. He's born in this place called Stratford upon Avon uh, in Warwickshire, England. And yeah, that's you can see there on the map. It's kind of in the middle part of England, that red chunk. Remember, England is essentially a big old island off the tip of France, of the northwestern tip of France, and it's between France and Scotland. And so London is just to the southeast of that red dot. Since our story, as far as Shakespeare goes, will unfold in the streets of London, though it is channeling late Republic Rome. Okay, most of Shakespeare's plays are written between 89 and 1613, so he has a kind of a 2 decade plus long uh, era there where he's producing most of what we know him for. His contemporaries, meaning people who are writing at the same time as him, include this guy Ben Jonson, who writes a play on Catiline, which I like very much, and Christopher Marlowe, whose most famous play is probably Faust. So it's important to think of Bill Shakespeare as not existing in a cultural vacuum. He has influence coming from people who he's surrounded by, who he's even friends with, and there's a little bit of a tradition that's starting up in English literature, though he's a big part of why English literature kind of uh, is able to take off in the way it does. Also, he is writing mostly under Queen Elizabeth. She reigns from 1558, so from what is that? From 6 years before he is even born to just a little more than 15 years after before he dies, and then King James takes over for the last decade of Shakespeare's life. Yeah, so Queen Elizabeth, that's why we're going to call this Elizabethan literature, Elizabethan London, or Elizabethan era London slash England, because this, I mean, she's reigning for half a century there, and a lot of things that happen under her are very important, and we will kind of get to them. You can see that as an illustration of the Globe Theater to the lower left. Also, where are we at with the English language? That's one way we can kind of check in on that because that's important. We'll get into it, but England has recently kind of transformed in the past century or so. England and London specifically has gone from being this kind of like whatever place off the western side of Europe that doesn't have a ton going for it to very recently being a more metropolitan area. If we're talking about London, a bigger military power. And more important culturally in terms of the kind of cultural products they are producing. So what I'm basically saying is that England goes from being a backwater, nowhere kind of place to really putting its name on the map in a similar way to what Rome does in the earlier part of the Republic. It's kind of the same place where Rome was at when the Punic Wars were happening, where they're just about to kind of have this breakthrough and become this major power. England is kind of undergoing that at the time, and the language of English is actually about to finally kind of come into maturity, and it's partly because of people like Will Shakespeare and his contemporaries like Marlowe that English is able to finally kind of flex, and people like John Milton, just a little bit after Shakespeare's life, will take it all the way into the territory of being this language that is capable of truly complex and beautiful expressions. We've talked about that before. Latin was doing the same kind of thing when Virgil was writing. Some people were thinking, "Oh, I don't know if you can even write an epic in Latin. I don't know if Latin is like complex enough." And people like Virgil or Cicero was like, "No, like I'm gonna take what is here with this language, and I'm going to prove that it is worthy of expressing good and mature and profound." Expressions, to use that word once again. All right, notable events that happened in the 1500-year gap that we have going on here. We don't want to just gloss over 1500 years in terms of like, we have some familiarity with late Republican Rome and early empirical Rome, or imperial rather. But what happens after that? So one thing is the relocation of the capital of Rome to Byzantium or Turkey, and that happens in the 4th century CE. So almost 400 years after Virgil is alive, we move Rome out of the Italian peninsula to Turkey. So it is now, located in what is technically Asia. They become Christian and they speak Greek instead of Latin. So Rome undergoes a whole lot of changes in the 400 years or so after Virgil passes on. So the Roman Empire keeps going, but it's centered around this eastern half of the empire, whereas the western half is mostly just chaos for hundreds of years. The Italian peninsula itself is constantly kind of falling to chaos thanks to German barbarians who are filling out the Roman ranks. And yeah, Italy will have trouble reunifying for a while, and we enter what is we sometimes call the Dark Ages or the Medieval Ages in Europe, which is just this kind of catchword that we use to refer to everything that's happening kind of between this relocation of Rome and basically the Renaissance. So almost 1,000 years of quote unquote darkness. Of course, there's plenty of good things going on still, but we have some bad things too, and we'll get to that. So, jumping ahead a lot, so we have the Dark Ages happening, we have feudalism, kings and queens and knights and castles. Some of that imagery actually is applicable to this time, though we don't want it to cartoonishly be reductive about what European history is like during this time. But if we get all the way to the 11th century, very quickly, we have what's called the Norman invasion, which is an invasion of England by the Normans, which are French people. And so make sure we have a good grounding on basic geography here. If you look at that map, we see the UK, that's the island thing, and Ireland is to the west, and Scotland is attached to the UK. So I think I misspoke earlier. I'm sorry. Ireland is that even smaller island to the west of England. Sorry, Mr. Graham. And that's England there with Scotland is actually connected. So you can drive a car from London to Edinburgh, which is a city, or Glasgow, both cities in Scotland. But to get to Ireland, you'd have to take a ferry. Anyway, and then that's France to the lower right there, right? That's France. So it makes sense that during feudalist times, French warlords would be invading English territories. It happens, and a big result of this, the reason why it's kind of like vaguely important to us, is that this has a big impact on the English language. We get a lot of Latin injected into our language at this time because we get a lot of French injected into our language, and French was very, very Latin because of what Julius Caesar had been doing 1,000 years prior to this. Okay, I'm gonna keep moving kind of quickly. I feel like I'm probably losing some attention spans here, but all of these factoids kind of add up to paint a valuable picture, I think. Okay, we also have the Black Death. That's kind of interesting, right? In the 14th century, if we move ahead a few hundred years from this moment of French language kind of flooding our language in terms of influence, we have the Black Death, or the bubonic plague, whatever you want to call it. It ravages Eurasia, killing up to 200 million people. That is 30 to 60% of the population, people. Pretty crazy. Yeah, and so this had a lot to do with vermin and, yeah, just infecting the masses. It was not good. Not good, right? But just after this, we get a glimmer of something positive in that the Renaissance starts to kind of finally blossom up out of the soil that is Italy. At this point, it kind of originates there for Europe and then spreads west. But I'm glossing over the fact that this guy Chaucer writes the Canterbury Tales in the 14th century, and that is some of our first quote unquote important English literature of the quote unquote English canon, though it is different than the kind of English we will see in Shakespeare's works some 200 years later. All right, the Renaissance starts in Italy, and what that basically means is ideas like humanism, which is caring about people, to be wildly reductive, and interest in the quote unquote classics. All right, of the ancient works like Virgil and Homer that we spent all of this school year going over. Renewed interest in those things start to kind of spread west from Italy. And this is good. We cartoonishly see Europe kind of clawing its way out from this quote unquote dark age by like picking up Virgil and Homer and being like, oh yeah, these were good. Remember these? And that is way too reductive, way too cartoonish of an image to kind of have. But there is some validity to that a little bit. All right, everything we have read up to this point truly is the one like the cornerstone of the inspiration for a lot of Renaissance thinkers. Okay, last little point. England begins to be established as a formidable military power towards the end of the 16th century. So a lot of under Elizabeth specifically, we have some successful military encounters, like the one with the Spanish Armada, where the Spanish Armada are going to come mess with England, and then a storm wrecks their armada, and so England wins. But it's not really because of England; it's because of the weather. But it's positioning England as this powerful nation, this kind of up and coming nation. And we'll also talk about the interesting things Elizabeth's dad did in terms of the Church of England. Okay, we have this conflict brewing between Protestantism and Catholicism, which is interesting. We'll get into that a little bit later. But yeah. Again, this is Queen Elizabeth, not the current Queen Elizabeth, who is Elizabeth II, the current Queen of England. All right, here's a map of London contemporary to the time that Shakespeare would have been alive. So we have London proper on the northern side of the Thames. Okay, people, let's see, is this word on the, yeah, if you see there in the middle, the river Thames, that's Thames, not Thames, like I think I thought it was the one time I left this country and went to England. It's the Thames. Okay, and plays would only occur across the Thames. It was an issue of legality. Theater districts were kind of something that would go hand in hand with more criminal activity laden parts of the city, meaning there's a lot of kind of shady characters hanging out in the same parts of the city where you'd actually have theater as something that was legally allowed to even occur. So all of that was happening across the river. London is Rome-esque in this time, and that has become this major metropolitan area rife with class diversity, meaning we have like royalty, located here in London, as well as a lot of impoverished people, and there's a lot of crime as well. So anytime you have a major kind of culturally important, significant place like London, you're also going to have things like crime and poverty and overcrowding. And like I said, theater was only allowed across the River Thames. Only men acted. That's how things have been for thousands of years. During Sophocles' plays, only men were the actors. I think it's less weird to us at that time. Everyone's wearing weird masks, and we know how weird the Greeks are. Whereas this is only 500 years ago, so there's almost something weirder, uh, in terms of thinking about the fact that only men were playing Juliet and Desdemona and Ophelia and Queen Lear were all played by men. And we'll get into the whys of that, but some of it just goes back to old fashioned thinking. Okay, and there's an unfortunate bear baiting problem. Another very Roman thing, like between play acts, they would bring out bears and kind of basically it's like a version of gladiatorial man versus animal kind of uh, entertainment. That just kind of paints a picture of when people were going to the Globe Theater to watch a play, they wanted something that is almost akin to the kind of blockbuster movie style entertainment that people go to movies nowadays for, or the NFL or any kind of big sporting event. It's you want something that's kind of loud and dumb and big and entertaining. So you wouldn't necessarily think of really like truly amazing literature coming out of that context, but that's what Shakespeare ends up doing. Okay, quick biography, and then I just want to set up the initial character so that we can actually get to reading this play. All right, so this guy gets married to Anne Hathaway, the famous actress who plays Catwoman in The Rise of Batman. Just kidding, just a coincidental name overlap, I guess. Around 26, they have twins. And then we don't really know a ton about what Shakespeare is doing up until the 90s. So remember, he's born in the 60s. Okay, we don't know a ton about him until like the early 90s. All of a sudden, his name starts showing up in the kind of archives of the dramatic scene, the theater scene in and around London around the 90s. Initially, he's writing a lot of his histories. Um, Towards the end of like 2 decades of like writing and producing tons of these really famous plays that'll stand the test of time. He retires to Stratford upon Avon, and yeah, Julius Caesar, which we'll refer to as JC, is first performed in 1599. So I'm kind of let's see. So the dates of when his plays are first conceived, we usually are going off of the fact of when they seem to first be performed, but there is some looseness to the dates of his bibliography. We're not 100% certain on all of it, but earlier plays include Taming of the Shrew, which might sound familiar. That's one of his comedies. King Henry VI, so he does a lot of histories that are specifically about English kings, some of which are pretty recent, including eventually Queen Elizabeth's dear old dad. Romeo and Juliet, of course, this is one of his most famous romantic tragedies, and Comedy of Errors, another comedy. Middle period plays include Julius Caesar here, Hamlet, which is my personal favorite, and Othello, which is, I'm not sure if people know that one as well as some of the other ones. And then later years, she has King Lear, which is very intense and kind of what some people would probably consider maybe the peak of his tragic writing in terms of being a tragedy. Antony and Cleopatra, which is basically a sequel to Julius Caesar. So that's, again, a kind of a history with a bit of a tragic element. And I kind of wonder if we can maybe if we'll move quickly enough to read some of that. And Tempest, his last play, one of his weirder ones, has like fairies and all kinds of weird stuff going on. And it's largely about him. Also, he has sonnets published towards the end of his life, tons of sonnets, but we don't know exactly when they are written. In the 90s, at one point, the theater is closed down for a whole year, and at that point, he produces some poetry, none of which are actually the sonnets that we know him for now. But the closing down of the theater at that time was due to a plague that was going around. So, kind of familiar, right? I guess that's kind of a thing throughout history. But yeah, the sonnets are not published towards the end of his life. We will talk about the publishing history, the publication history of some of his stuff as we go along because it's kind of interesting. There are different versions of different plays, and plays weren't always like written out in a way that they were going to be published. but we still end up with most of his work intact, which is good. Okay, who are our dramatic people that we're going to be looking at? Well, Julius Caesar, obviously, right? So some of the same people we've been talking about to get historical ground backdrop rather for Aeneid, they're going to be showing up again. So not all of these people, but Julius Caesar specifically, who now I will proceed to just do a quick recap of in terms of getting you to where he is in this play. So Julius Caesar, born in year 100, he is this kind of controversial, um, corrupt politician in Rome. Okay, he works with this guy Pompey, who is this famous general, and this guy Crassus, who is very rich, to basically get what he does what he has to do to get what he wants. He clashes with people like Cicero, who will be in this play. Cicero is a hardcore Republican in that he is very much about the virtues of Republican Rome and not wanting a king to take over and not wanting people to overreach and be corrupt. So Julius Caesar clashes with someone like that, very much so. Um, so he's in Rome, he's being a politician, and then he becomes consul for a little while and he does a lot of corrupt things while he's a consul, and he'd probably get in legal hot water for it if he didn't escape to Gaul. He goes to France. Gaul is our ancient word for France, and he spends a full decade there conquering just every Gaulish and Germanic tribe he comes across. It's crazy to imagine spending this much time and doing that much damage, but what he does is akin to genocide in that he is just making a mess of these poor, unorganized, ununified people. And the ones who are lucky enough to survive, I suppose, usually end up joining his army. Now, the amount of time that he spends doing this and the size of an army that he starts to amass starts to worry the Roman people, and they start wondering if he needs to be called back to Rome so he can be put on trial for the things he did while he was consul. And so eventually this kind of results in him saying, okay, you want me to come back? I will come back, but you know what? I'm going to come back with my whole army, which you're not supposed to do unless it's to celebrate a victory. Uh, and I'm going to basically go to war with Rome, with Italy, which is, I'm Roman, I'm Italian, but I'm going to go to war with myself, my own people, which is, this is civil war, right? So the die is cast, is what he says as he crosses the Rubicon, which is the northern boundary between Italy and Gaul. Okay, and yeah, he has a lot of territories to contend with. So Pompey and Cicero and a lot of the statesmen, they leave Rome. They say, hey, you know what? You can take the city. We're going to leave. And they regroup in Greece and parts of Africa and basically wait to take on Julius Caesar. Um, and then, of course, if we skip ahead 5+ years after he crosses the Rubicon, this is what happens. And this is going to happen again in the middle of this play or so. It's not the climax of the play. It doesn't feel like a spoiler. I think we know that this happens. So that's what we're working towards. But let's kind of build up to it a little bit. The Ides of March are going to come up a lot. That just means basically the 15th of a month. Sometimes it's the 13th. Idus is this. It's a word that means like it's a word for the middle of the month, basically. And his wife starts getting these visions or hearing prophecies about something bad happening on the Ides of March, which is a day before he leaves for a campaign. But we have to cycle back even further than this to get the full context. So 5 years before he crosses that Rubicon, Iacta Alia Est, the die is cast. He knows this might not work out for him, okay, but he does it anyway. So upon doing this, pretty quickly, he's able to lay claim to all of that blue territory you see there. The peninsula is forfeited to him. His army is so big and impressive that they leave it to Pompey to decide. They're like, hey, Pompey, are we going to fight for the city or are we going to stay here? Pompey's like, no, man, let's go to Greece. Let's go right now. He can have this peninsula right now. We'll come back and fight him later. So Julius Caesar has all of Spain. He has all of France. He has all of Italy. He just needs to go chase down his opposition who are hiding out essentially in Greece and Africa. And so, and by the way, I'm sorry, these notes are pulled from older PowerPoints. You don't quite need these notes. The notes earlier on Shakespeare, yeah, but like these, not so much. Don't worry too much about them. I just truly actually want you guys to know the plot points here. Okay, so he has to go fight Pompey in Greece, and he wins. He defeats Pompey. Pompey himself leaves, though. If you look at We have a little diagram of what their battle was like. Caesar is able to rout Pompey in Greece. Pompey himself survives, though his army has been defeated, and he sails to Alexandria, to Egypt, and he wants to ask Egypt for help, specifically Ptolemy the 12th, who is having a bit of a clash with his sister Cleopatra. So this is all kind of important. I know you're probably just like, oh my gosh, like there's so many details. So Pompey gets to Egypt. He's like, hey, Ptolemy 12, I know you're having a fight with your sister right now, and that she's not allowed in the city. But do you want to help me out? You wanna like link up, and we can stand up to Julius Caesar together? And Ptolemy 12 is like, maybe I'm into that. You should come ashore, talk to my people, and we'll talk about it. So Pompey comes to shore, and he gets immediately backstabbed and betrayed by Ptolemy 12, who has his men behead Pompey and kill him immediately. Why does Ptolemy do this and not want to even try to work with him? It's because he's already heard that Pompey has lost to Julius Caesar, and he knows which way the wind is blowing at this point. Julius Caesar then arrives in Alexandria, and he stays there. He's welcomed by Ptolemy 12, who is basically um, uh, uh, controlling Alexandria, which is the capital of Egypt. And so Ptolemy is saying like, oh, like yeah, we should work together. Um, but Cleopatra shows up in a rug. Cleopatra has one of her henchmen sneak her into the city in a rug. Again, she's having a fight with her brother, dynastic conflict. She shows up and says, hey, Julius Caesar, you want to work together? You want to be best friends and fight against my brother and my sister? And Julius Caesar's like, yeah, sure, let's do it. So he spends like the rest of the summer in Egypt fighting Cleopatra's brother for her, with her. They win. Cleopatra's brother kind of dies, or at least we think he dies. We don't really know for sure what happens. But Cleopatra wins. They go on a cruise on the Nile, even though Julius Caesar is technically married to Calpurnia, a poor Roman woman right now. And then he does a few more things, going around the Mediterranean, cleaning up some of the other remaining Roman opposition that he has, including Cato, and he returns to Rome to become dictator. So he's imperator, dictator, dictator, basically. He says he's not a king, but that he is basically in charge. He gives himself all these titles. And then we proceed to have these 4 years of things kind of calming down in Rome. And along come Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longus. They're going to show up in the first acts that you guys read today. And they're senators. The one thing I want you to know about Brutus, I mean, you probably already kind of know the story, right? I guess I'm not going to really kind of like act like I'm not trying to spoil whatever happens. But Brutus here, his great grandfather was supposed to be the guy who expelled the last king of Rome hundreds of years prior to this. Same family name as this guy who did this, and what is basically mythology. And so that does play a part in the way Brutus thinks about things. Cassius is kind of like he's kind of like the bad guy whispering things in his ear to Brutus, and Brutus is kind of caught between different ideas, different ways of thinking about things during this play. So for Wednesday, guys, this is all to say. Go ahead and read those first 3 scenes. It should not take you too long at all. I want to see how we do with the language. I think you're going to have much better luck with it than you did, what's the word, Sophocles. I'm going to try my best to find a PDF version with footnotes, but I'm having a lot of trouble finding that. And even the hard copies we had don't have footnotes in the way I want them to, which are best when they're kind of clearing up some of the more oblique language. And stand by for more information pertaining to if I might leave a box of those books out. I could do that as early as today. I'm making this video ahead of time, so I'm not totally sure. I'll write it in the form, but what I might do is just like kind of set a box full of copies of Julius Caesar in front of the school, like the front doors where the office is. And I might just have it there on like Monday and Tuesday, today and Tuesday rather, or one of those days. If not today, maybe tomorrow, maybe Tuesday. And it'll just be out there, and you can come get it if you want, but it'll be optional because obviously some people aren't, don't really want to risk it at all. But I will let y'all know about that because I have to kind of see how things go. So, good luck with that, and enjoy the play. We're definitely going to read it in a Zoom session. If not Wednesday, next week for sure. Next week for sure. So, hope we'll be more used to the Zoom reading by that time. But good luck getting into it, and we'll talk about it on Wednesday.